Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to you and welcome. So I'm going to be covering 2,000 years of history in 45 minutes. Now, I can either speak fast, or I can take the salient points which I think are relevant to where we're going and what we've learnt so far together. So I'm going to be talking and taking the salient points, the most important points. That is part of the Ottoman Empire. As you can see on this particular map, and this is dated 1602, is the map of the Ottoman Empire, which is basically the mustard-coloured area of the eastern part of the Mediterranean, going down to the top end of North Africa, right through to Greece. And we'll get a little bit more about that and that flavour as we move on. So, the things that I do when I'm doing a presentation, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I tell you, then I tell you what I've told you. And I've mentioned that before. So therefore, I'm going to split this presentation down into 4 areas. I'm going to set the stage. I'm then going to look at the early rise of the Ottomans. We're then going to talk about the Ottomans' golden age. Whenever you have an empire will always, always, always decline. And therefore, I'm going to be talking right at the end about the decline and the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. So let's talk a little bit about setting the scene. And I think it might be helpful to understand what the Middle East area was like in our period of time. We're talking AD. We're talking after Christ. 285 years after Christ, in fact. The Roman Empire at that time was far too large to manage, and it collapsed. As you may remember when we did the Roman Empire, and it collapsed because it was too big, it was mismanaged, it had very much a corrupt government, and the Roman Empire was split into the east and into the west. The Western Empire, Roman Empire, collapsed as a regards to a defeat of their last emperor, whose name was Romulus Augustus, in 476 AD, when he fought the Germanic chieftain. So that's the Western Roman Empire out of the scene. That leaves the Eastern Roman Empire. It was really, it was a Roman Empire under Roman rule until 1453. The person next came in was Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, and he conquered Constantinople, which was the capital of the Ottoman Empire at the time, with cataclysmic results as regards to that. But we'll go through that in a moment. So this existing Eastern Roman Empire was known as the Byzantine Empire. The term Byzantine comes from the ancient Greek colony called Byzantium, and it was founded by a man called Byzas. So it's quite confusing, but really the Byzantine Empire is actually the Eastern Roman Empire. So if we accept that that's how it started, and it started with Constantinople in 330 AD, named after the first Roman emperor, who was Emperor Constantine the Great, and you can see him on the left-hand side of the slide. He was the first of the Roman Empire emperors to be converted into Christianity, and Constantinople, as you probably know, is the modern Istanbul in Turkey. And it was the seat of the centre of power of the Byzantium. And it was over 1,000 years that the Eastern Roman Empire, or if you like, the Byzantine Empire was ruled by 94 emperors over that period of time. Emperor Julius I in the centre, he ruled at the peak of the Byzantine Empire. He was a good legislator, he was a reformer, and he reduced corruption between his area of influence. Now, the size of the Byzantine Empire, as you can see at its peak, you can see they're coloured in the pink. All of Turkey, North Africa, right through to Greece, into Italy, Corsica, and through Sicily, and the southern part of Spain. A huge area. In fact, most of the Mediterranean had an influence by the Byzantines. But during this time, the Christian religion was reducing its power and is retreating from the east, going west. And the last Byzantine emperor was Constantine the 11th. He's the man on the right-hand side, and he died in 1453, which was then the end of the Byzantine Empire, which fell to the Ottomans, which then was the spread of Islam from east to west. So we're now in a sort of a religious conflict between Christianity and between Islam. Two totally different ideologies and religious beliefs. So with that in mind, we're moving on now with religion in our head. We're moving on to the 11th and the 14th centuries because there were great conflicts between the East and the West at that particular time. With the removing or the retreating of Christianity from the East going more to the West, that Christian faith was retreating, the Muslim threat from Islam was increasing. And if you like, the Muslims required and needed to have expeditions. And the expeditions went from the East to the West, which was then actually counteracted from the West to the East with the Crusades. Now, you probably heard of the Crusades when you went on your excursions today in Rhodes. They were very much part of what's happening here in Greece. And this particular slide reminds us of some of the Christian responses against the Muslim threat and the dominance that they had in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. And these Crusades were a series of campaigns by the European Christians, to check and to stop, if they could, the spread of Islam from the East spreading westwards. And the main aim of the Crusades was to recover Jerusalem from the Holy Land, which had been taken by the Muslims. There were 8 major crusades at the time, the first beginning in 1096, and this was funded by the Pope, Pope Urban II, who had put the aim of recapturing Jerusalem from the Muslims, who had then control of the Holy Land. The last crusade ended in 1291, and that's nearly 200 years worth of religious conflict between East and West. But there was one specific crusade, which was the 4th crusade, didn't actually get to Islam. They attacked Constantinople, rather than going on to Jerusalem and the Holy Land. And the reason they wanted to attack Constantinople, because it was actually financed by the Venetians, and the Venetians wanted to ensure that they could get control of the Silk Road, which kept all of the Europe's economics going because of the lucrative spice trade that was happening at that particular time. But overall, the Crusades were unsuccessful. They prolonged all the conflicts, and Jerusalem and the Holy Land over this period of time remained under Muslim control. And ironic, really, isn't it, that the word Jerusalem has its roots in the word shalom, meaning peace. And the common interpretation, of course, is the city of peace. And as I'm sure we are all aware, that is not necessarily right in the 21st century. Moving on now to about the 1200s, while setting the scene, it's worth noting that the Ottoman Empire consisted of a vast geographical area, which you can see, some 8 million square miles. It is, however, smaller than the Byzantine Empire. It includes most of Central Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean, large swathes of the Middle East, and the North African coast. There were 36 Ottoman sultans between 1299 and 1922, and 35 million people in the mid-19th century come under the sultan's ultimate control. And the empire, the Ottoman Empire, lasted for 600 years. The names and the images on the bottom of the slide will be mentioned later during this particular presentation to bring some personalities into it. So I've now set the scene of where we're at. Now let's have a look at the early rise of the Ottoman Empire. We're now in the 1300s and in a place called Anatolia. And I'm sure you all know that Anatolia is now called Turkey. And that particular part of the world was administered by the Beyliks. And the Beyliks are the small Turkish principalities that are ruled by a bey. And who's the bey? The bey is a ruler. And the slide shows here the number of principalities in that particular part of the world, in Anatolia, in 1300 AD. But as allegiances changed, as conflicts changed within the principalities, they needed to have a leader. They needed someone who could congeal all of these principalities together in order to make it work as a proper country, as it were, or somewhere that could fight and make them survive. And there was. And his name was Osman I. And he laid the foundations of the Ottoman dynasty and the empire. And let's have a little look closer about Osman I. Initially, there was very little known about this man. There was no contemporary records about him until about 100 years after Osman I's death. And then the Ottomans start to write about him. The legend is that he had a dream from his town in Sujit, you can see there. And his dream is quite important because he dreamt that he and his descendants would rule over a prosperous empire, and he and his descendants would become the Anatolian Ghazi. An Anatolian Ghazi. What on earth is that? Well, an Anatolian Ghazi is a Muslim warrior who fights all the wars and any wars against non-Muslims. And in this particular situation, it was the Christian Roman Empire, or indeed the Byzantine Empire, who were Christians at that time. So that was his dream. That's what he wanted. And actually, he did it because he gelled all these principalities together in one group to make it a formidable force against the retreating Christians and the increase in the Muslims coming from the east. He undertook a number of successful raids to the west. We then had Sultan Murad I. He's the next person on the scene. You can see him on the left-hand side of the screen, and he accelerated that push at pace. He then took Ankara, now what is called Ankara now in Turkey, Bulgaria. And over time, he developed his capabilities. He developed his strategies to move forward. He developed his military in order to go further and further and further. And in the end, he reached Serbia. But that wasn't enough. He needed to get further west into Venice. And if he could get into Venice, he would have access to Europe. That was his main aim. Get to Venice, get to Europe, get myself there, get my religion there, get myself more power. That's his aim. He got to Constantinople, and Constantinople at that time was the potent symbol of Christian power outside of Rome. It was the center of the Orthodox Christianity, and it was considered one of the ultimate prizes for the Ottomans. But the city was considered to be totally impregnable. Why? Because it had a huge, substantial defensive wall around that city, very similar and better than all of the fortifications you've seen here in Rhodes and what you might have seen in Malta and everywhere else we have been. But the fortifications around Constantinople were intense, and he really had to work hard to get himself in there. And it wasn't until Mehmed II took over the throne, his army attacked Constantinople with what was then new weapons. And new weapons in those days was the cannon. And with overwhelming forces and a 53-day siege, the Ottomans then took Constantinople. This had a cataclysmic effect throughout the Western world. Religious beliefs changed from Christian versus Islam. The Islam was getting closer and closer to the West, World trade was affected because the medieval world trade depended totally on the Silk Road, and the Silk Road provided all the economy with the silks, the spices, the porcelains that went through Venice and then into Europe. That had stopped because they went through Constantinople as well. And the ramifications of the taking of Constantinople by the Ottomans was huge. All of the intellectuals and all the scientists came out of Constantinople and poured into Europe. The European Renaissance started. The new thinking about what was life going to be like in Europe, the Renaissance period. Because the Silk Road had been chopped, they had to find, or the merchants had to find new ways of getting trade from the east to the west because they couldn't use the Silk Road. What did they do? They used a maritime exploration. What did that lead to? That leaded to massive maritime explorations. It led to the age of exploration, exploitation, excitement. It then started to build new ships. So that one action of catching and knocking out Constantinople by the Ottomans had a cataclysmic worldwide effect, certainly European effect at that particular time. Very important part of our history. At this stage, the Ottomans seemed totally unstoppable. The golden age of the Ottomans had arrived, and their dominance in the 16th century was huge. And they had victories in Athens. You can see the dates on the screens where we are going. They had victories in Egypt, Rhodes, as you know, Cyprus, and Crete, as you know. The Venetians, on the other hand, were a hard lot to beat, and they continued to resist the Ottomans because of the economics and because they wanted to have economic power. So they weren't always successful. Many of the Western opponents that are fighting the Ottoman invasions, among them the Venetians, there was the Bulgarians, there was the Croatians, there was the Serbians, all of which made many, many battles that ensued. And particularly one of the battles in Belgrade in 1456, this is when Mehmed II was defeated, he was wounded, and that particular battle was abandoned, and the mission was stopped, and he retreated back from whence he came. It would appear that the Ottoman advance to the west was temporarily placed on hold in 1456. But it wasn't to last forever, I have to tell you. So I mentioned the Golden Age. Having had the look at the early rise, let's have a little look at the Golden Age. If you went out on your excursions yesterday and today, you might have heard of Suleiman the Magnificent, or Suleiman the First. He is often known to be, or referred to, the Sultan of the Golden Age. And during his 46-year reign, he demonstrated magnificent statecraft. He was a very good administrator. He was also an excellent legislator and lawmaker, and he was able to ensure that the laws of that he required, it was him, was able to be spent out through the entire geographical area. And his main achievements were a huge military expansion once more, because he wanted to continue, if he could, to go further and further west. He wanted to increase trade, but not only within himself, but trade with the outside world, which means he had to, if you like, become more of a diplomat in order to get trade coming into his countries. He wanted economic growth, and he wanted to have a huge expansion of the Ottoman culture and indeed Ottoman art. And so he was responsible for many of the constructions, ordering the constructions of the mosques and other religious complexes. Many architects were greatly influenced by the huge architectural masterpiece in the Hagia Sophia, which is a colossal Byzantine church whose commanding dome has presided over the Istanbul skyline for many, many centuries. And there have been hundreds of public buildings, both from a religious and indeed a non-religious basis, that have been designed and constructed based on that model and that dome. I can give you 3 examples. One of them is St. Paul's Cathedral in London. There's the Taj Mahal in India, and there's St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, all of which have used that structure, that, if you like, that icon, as their own architectural masterpieces, which has lasted. He brought in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul and served as the Ottoman administration centre. And it was the residence of the Ottoman court until 1856. And there were courtyards, there were rooms, there were bathrooms, there was a hospital, there were 2 mosques within the buildings itself, within the palace itself. A harem, where he housed his family. It is now a museum. And within the palace itself, there are many magnificent cultural objects. And if you ever get a chance to go to Istanbul and see these, it is really very, very nice indeed. Gems, silks, miniature paintings, and religious objects abound this palace as part of the Ottoman culture. So it wasn't all death and glory. There was lots of other things going on as well. Now, the Ottomans, as I mentioned, started to get more diplomatic. And so there were many ceremonies and rituals that the Ottomans wanted to show to demonstrate their might and their wealth and the ultimate power of the Sultan. Lavish demonstrations of power was exercised whenever possible. When ambassadors came from the West, they were obliged to kneel in front of the Sultan, to genuflect, in other words, to bow down and get on their knees, and the Sultan would, at the flick of a finger, would say, rise or get up or do whatever you want to do. But the ambassadors would then present their credentials to the Sultan, followed by many, many elaborate gifts. Because it was then that the West realized that the Ottomans were very powerful. The West needed to be, if you like, more, not quite so controversial with them, and more helping in terms of diplomacy and in trade. And on this particular picture here, this painting here, you can see there were vast numbers of soldiers were massed inside and outside the palaces whenever any foreign dignitary came, as a demonstration of the Sultan's power and his wealth. Very much a PR and, if you like, propaganda exercise as well. But life under the Ottomans was actually quite tolerable, and it featured a number of elaborate music and dance rituals. The Ottomans loved military bands. It was a great favourite of the sultans. Literature, poetry and prose were the 2 principal literary forms for the Ottomans, influenced by the rich traditions from their roots, which was from Turkey and from Persia in their classical history. From a theatrical perspective, there were many storytellers that were travelling from the east to the west, entertaining small groups of people in coffee houses and other such places. The cuisine was based on regional diets and regional sources of ingredients, and the popular drinks that the Ottomans had was Turkish coffee in Turkish houses selling very, very sweet drinks and other very, very sweet confectionery. They loved the sweet things of life from a cuisine perspective. They also loved their paintings and miniature paintings, and derived from very much earlier Persian traditions. Within a small composition, and this would be a small composition seen on the slide, there are different scenes within it. And this particular slide shows an Ottoman army parading the walls of Tiflis, and where's that? Well, it's in Georgia, in August 1578, when the city was being evacuated. And you'll notice the real bright, intense colours, the reds, the greens, the blues. And they were all attained by grinding down pigments mixed with egg white as a binder for the paint, or later on with diluted gum to make it something that you could then put on either the canvas or whatever material you were using to put the painting on. Very, very bright colours indeed. But that was the way they liked it. They were also very much masters of calligraphy. And the calligraphy was strongly tied to the Quran. And the Quran, of course, being the Muslim holy book, as the Christian holy book would be the Bible. And chapters and excerpts from the Quran are a common and a universal text even today. And interestingly enough, the squares and the rectangles that you can see in the calligraphy on this slide resembles other Arabian motifs that you'll find in carpets, in tiles, in textiles, and indeed in ceramics. Ottoman silk textiles were out of this world, and one of the most elegant of textiles produced in the world. They were characterized really by huge, large-scale stylized motifs, often highlighted with a shimmering metallic threads to make them glow and shimmer. Bursa is a city in northwest Turkey, is renowned for its silks and brocades as shown on the left-hand side of the slide, and also the prayer rug on the right-hand side of the slide also came from northern Turkey in Persia, in Turkey. And very, very much a beautiful, magnificent piece of textile production. Because the courts of Istanbul were now receiving many envoys from all over the world, they really did take a liking to the porcelain that they got from China. And so this motivated the Ottomans for producing their own china, similar to the one that they saw from the Chinese porcelain. And by the 1700s, they were producing, the Ottomans were producing elaborate tiles being developed very similar to the ones you can see on this slide, both of which have got bold colours. They are patterned with decorations and ornaments from the Ottomans and the Ottoman walls and the palaces, and everywhere you could get and could go, you would probably find something like this in their houses and in the civic and religious structures that the Ottomans used during and throughout their empire. Absolutely beautiful when you come to see the ceramics like that, as are the Chinese, of course. Because of the richness of the culture and the products from the Ottomans, it spread into Europe. And it was seen as elegance to have something that was from an Ottoman base in Europe. In particular, the Dutch. They loved many of the components of Ottoman life. The tulip that you can see on the left-hand slide is the national flower of Turkey, but it portrays one of the most expensive bulbs in the early 1630s, during the time when the Dutch were absolutely gripped with tulip mania. And this particular tulip was really, really good to have. Wealthy Dutch houses had tulips in there. Same with the clothing. The painting on the center shows a person in an Ottoman dress, but this was a fashion statement for the rich and the wealthy Dutch people. And on the right-hand side, you can see a huge red carpet being shown to a lady of elegance. And the Northern European rich houses really wanted to have these fabulous red carpets or other carpets to make them show the emblems of wealth that the Europeans had because they came from the Ottoman area. So with all this going on, as I've mentioned at the beginning, all empires come to an end. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the end and the finish and the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. We're going to start off with 1571, the Battle of Lepanto. The Battle of Lepanto itself is situated in western Greece, and it was the turning point of the continuing conflicts between the Ottomans and the West. It was a point at which the Ottomans were not going to get any further. There was a naval fleet by the Holy League, and the Holy League was a collaboration of European Catholic states organized by the Pope, and his name was Pope Pius V. It was financed by King Philip of Spain, and the ships were supplied by Venice. And it was a major defeat by the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman fleet. It was the biggest naval battle in antiquity. 400 warships were involved with one side and the other. And as I mentioned, Lepanto represented this turning point. We're stopping the Ottomans going any further right now. And it was the biggest naval defeat, as I mentioned, for the Ottomans. This defeat stopped them going through to the Mediterranean and stopped them going further west. The Ottoman fleet captured 130 Ottoman vessels and destroyed more than 50 of them in total. Thousands and thousands of Christian slaves that were on those Ottoman ships were rescued from the enemy ships. And when you come to the death of people, and no one wants to talk about that, but the Christians lost about 7,000 men, whereas the Ottomans lost about 30,000 men. So that was a huge defeat for the Ottomans from a naval perspective. And that's the sort of battle raging, as you can see, that motif there and that picture there. It must have been pretty dreadful, I'd have thought. Also, moving on, in the 16th century, the Ottomans were battling on all fronts. And this map illustrates the magnitude of the problems that the Ottomans had in the 16th century. Whilst they were attempting to protect their empire, it was surrounded by other enemies. To the west, you had the battles in Vienna, the Mohawks and Zenta in the 1600s. To the east, you had the Ottomans making defeats in the Black Sea. And to the southwest, finally, the French actually fought the Ottomans and took control of Algeria in 1830 and 1847. And that time they won. But you can see the Ottomans were absolutely being squeezed from north, south, east, and west in order to reduce their influence over time. And during the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in Europe, there was a significant scientific and technical reforms that was going on in Europe. The Industrial Revolution had started. The Industrial Revolution is the making of steel, the making of warships, the bringing of the printing press is a real good example of the Industrial Revolution. And the Ottomans needed to reform their old ways in order to compete or modernize themselves to keep up with the West. The West was now beginning to get more control, more advanced than the East, because they were perhaps in their old ways. Perhaps the Ottomans were more content trying to protect their boundaries, whereas the West was trying to get themselves more industrialized, becoming more efficient in the way they were doing things. So this required the Ottomans to have great reforms and modernizations in order to keep up with the West. And it included the bringing in of a constitution, the bringing in of a more, if you like, modern military. There were secular laws coming in order to replace religious laws. And what do I mean by secular laws? Secular laws means that the laws deal with the conflicts between people and ideas rather than religious beliefs and religious dogmas. There was also reforms in the Ottoman banking system. There was an industrial policy that changed. New installations were introduced. The first post office was introduced in the Ottoman world. And there's a man called Sultan Abdulhamid II instigated the first, as I mentioned, the first constitution. And this laid down the groundwork for later reforms and then indeed a first Turkish state under its leader. And the first Turkish state leader was Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And we'll discuss him in a moment. So we're now in the, if you like, the 18th and 19th centuries. We're now moving into the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century and the First World War. The Gallipoli campaign was in 1915 to 1916, and it was a total disaster. It was an unsuccessful attempt for the Allied powers at the time to control the sea route from Europe to Russia during World War I. The Allies were, in those times, it was the British, it was the French, the Australians, and the New Zealand troops, known as the Anzacs. And they took on a fierce resistance in the Dardanelles, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. Allied forces suffered heavy losses as they tried to get an amphibious landing on Gallipoli, which was being fiercely resisted by the Turks. The Allies actually made very little headway after their initial landing, and they started their evacuation in December 1915 very quickly. But this Eastern Front in World War I highlighted two specific individuals as worthy of note. The first one, from the Allies' perspective, was the role of a man called Winston Churchill, who spearheaded the attack at the time, and he would become the Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II. And also from the Ottomans' perspective, it was the rise of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and he would become the first leader of the newly established country known as Turkey, which followed World War I. And we'll talk about him again in a moment. But like many countries, they have a little history that perhaps not very savoury. And this is one. This is Armenia. And later in 1915, a program of planned deportation took place by countless Armenians, which are today on Turkish soil, but it took place in that time in 1915. But it was really a lot more than just deportation. Some historians and journalists claim that this was the polity of absolute senseless slaughter between 600,000 and 1.5 million ethnic Armenians. And even now, today, it is a controversial subject for the Turkish authorities. The Turkish government continued to deny that the scope and the size of many of this and the practices that took place during this deportation in that period of time. But historians believe that this was actually the first 20th century program of ethnic cleansing. I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes history can be extremely uncomfortable to read and indeed uncomfortable to try and understand. But those are the facts. So following World War I, the treaty and pact came between the victorious powers, which was the British and the French and the European powers against Germany and Turkey, and the Ottoman Turkey agreed that they would abolish the Ottoman Empire. They would divide the Ottoman Empire into different zones under a treaty, and the Treaty of Sèvres. And this was a formal end of the Ottoman Empire. And this particular treaty obliged the Ottoman government, to do a number of things. Firstly, to renounce all rights for the Arabian Asia and all rights for North Africa. They required to provide an independent Armenia, or an autonomous Kurdistan, and to permit a Greek presence in the east. So this was also part of the requirement. The treaty wasn't ratified by the Turks, and many of the demands were actually then rejected. This would lead to the national government being formed by this man called Atatürk. And it resulted in the Turkish War of Independence, which started in 1919 and completed in 1923. And Atatürk, is now credited to be the founder of the first Republic of Turkey. He was the first president in 1923 until his death 15 years later, and he undertook a number of social reforms and liberal reforms, creating a secular society. He had many cultural reforms. He brought in primary school education, which was both compulsory and it was free. He introduced a Turkish Latin-based alphabet rather than an Ottoman-based alphabet, which is far more difficult. Turkish women were granted many equal rights and the protection that were afforded to the men. And the full universal suffrage happened in 1934. So he was a great reformer, this man called Atatürk. So in summary, I've told you what I've told you, now I'm going to tell you what I've told you. The longevity of the Ottomans lasted some 600 years. And during that period, there were significant changes, not only in the East, but also in the West. Culturally and religiously, there were all these changes. This is a period where, from the Ottomans' perspective, the Sultan had absolute ultimate power. There was ethnic and linguistic diversity across this vast region under the Sultan's absolute control. He had the military in his hands. The Ottoman artistic and cultural achievements were outstanding, and they were highly achieved and highly required luxury goods for the people of Europe, and they were in great demand for the West. And what did the empire leave in terms of its legacy? Well, it left the world officially after the Second World War. However, the influences that the Ottomans had left, we have seen in our own eyes why we have been out here on this particular cruise. We've seen it, we've heard it, we've felt it, we've probably smelt it. The Ottomans were a country, were a culture that were brilliant in what they did during that particular time, but there are one or two unsavory parts that perhaps we should take note of for the future. And of course, I'd like to thank you for turning up. I know sometimes there are other things going on that perhaps might be of more interest, but I do thank you to the bottom of my heart to come and listen to what we have to say. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed presenting to you. You've been a great crew, brilliant, and I hope we can cruise again together in the near future. Thank you very much indeed.